Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
My name is Michel Danino. I'm a visiting professor at IIT Gandhinagar, and I'm going to speak today on India's ancient and pre-colonial educational systems, approaches, methods, and institutions. This is, of course, a brief overview, and it is part of a course on Indian knowledge systems organized by the IKS division of the Ministry of Education. So with this, we will now explore the world of education in ancient India, and we will come back to this picture a little later. But before we do so, we have to set the main question, which is basically, was there education in India before the British times? There is no dispute about that, but someone like Thomas Macaulay, famous statesman, writer, orator of the early 19th century, asserted that a single shelf of a good European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Indian education consists of false history, false astronomy, false medicine, in company with a false religion. So these are two very contrasting views. And what exactly is the truth is what we should explore in this talk. Before we go back in time, I want to highlight a few more colonial stereotypes on pre-colonial education of India for the simple reason that they are still alive with us. We keep hearing them, and people repeat them without, of course, studying the background of this whole problem, this whole question. They accept what our colonial masters declared, and they do not look further. Even today, this is very common. For example, the fact that lower castes were denied access to education. We will see that this is not true, and that it was reserved, therefore, to upper castes. Also, that most of education dealt with religion and mythology. Read superstition again. This is completely incorrect. So, apart from that, we also have a very interesting alternate view on not the Indian ignorance, but the British ignorance of India by the celebrated Thomas Huxley, who you may remember took the side very early on of Darwin on the point of human evolution, but he also did considerable work of his own. And Huxley basically blamed the English system of education, he says it's peculiar, which is ironic, for not teaching anything substantial about India, and therefore leaving the British public in deep ignorance of India, which explains the presence of all these stereotypes. Let us now embark on our journey, and if we go really as far back in time as we can, we have to go to the Harappan or Indus or in the Saraswati civilization, where we find some clues about education. Of course, do not expect schools or universities. We know nothing about that. We are only going by physical remains, artifacts. And for example, toys. Lots of toys, as you can see here, toy carts, rocking bulls. You have to imagine a semicircular wooden arc of circle under the bull, whistles, rattles, all kinds of balls that could be thrown. Of course, we have them in terracotta only, and so on. So therefore there were games, but games are part of education, but they are not, all today considered as the center of education, which is a pity in a way, because games should be one of the major tools, methods, pedagogies used in education. Now let's continue, and what is fascinating is this presence of these small size terracotta replicas of wooden taktis. A takti which was used in India till recently. I've met people who told me that their parents, grandparents were using taktis at school. It's basically a small plank of wood, about this size usually, where you can write and erase. You can just rub it off, and you have this little handle with a hole in it, because when you come back from school in the evening, you can hang it on a nail on your wall. And this is exactly what these replicas are showing. So it's interesting because we know that the Harappans had writing, but this shows that this was a tool by which people, or maybe some children, were actually taught this writing. Otherwise, there would be no purpose for this. Jumping in time by nearly 2,000 years, we come to the historical period. And there is evidence, of course, lots of literary evidence, and I will come to that, but a little bit of archaeological evidence also here and there, such as, for example, this child. We don't know whether it's a boy or a girl, unfortunately. The child has anklets, but this could mean either still. And this child is proudly pointing to letters of the ancient Indian Brahmi script on a takti, the very same takti that you see in Harappan civilization 2,000 years earlier. So this is interesting because now this shows a child learning letters, literacy. We don't have more context than this. This is from the Shunga era, 2nd century BC or so, and we don't really, we cannot quantify the extent of education, of course, in those days, except we can get some more clues from the literature. Before we look at the literature, let us emphasize the fact that education is regarded as sacred in ancient India. Transmitting knowledge, that's what education is about. That is actually the best summary of education. Transmission of knowledge. That's from the instructor to the recipient. If we look at it from the point of view of the recipient, there are other definitions, of course. But transmission of knowledge is regarded as sacred. You have here a beautiful panel from Barhut, the Buddhist site in the 2nd century BC. And you see how a master, of course, on an elevated platform, is teaching his disciples who faithfully recite or repeat what they are learning. They're not exactly young, but they are young enough, and we don't know exactly what specialized branch of knowledge this is referring to. Please note the presence of the tree. Often teaching would happen below a tree. In the hot climate of India, this might be the best arrangement. You might still get some breeze rather than a closed building in those days, which may not always be suitable. But we will see soon some notable exceptions. Now, the texts, and I'll allude to them. There are many, many texts. I've just selected a few to give you a taste of how education is valued, regarded as something sacred activity. Knowledge itself, of course, is sacred. We have deities to symbolize knowledge, such as Saraswati herself, and so on. So here we have from the Taittiriya Upanishad, one of the most ancient ones, we have a kind of initiation of the student to the full adult life once the student leaves school. So this student is about to leave his 12 years, because it used to be 12 years, this is in other texts, to leave this schooling, this education. Schooling is not, of course, a proper term unless we keep it flexible. And what is the student now told as a preparation for adult life, as a useful citizen of his or her country? So it's about truth, it's about dharma, it's about venerating one's parents, the teacher also, even guests. These are the famous mantras which are well known. And I will read only the last part. You should perform only those actions which are irreproachable and no others. So this is about ethics and conduct. It's not about religion. You should honor only those good practices that you have observed in us, your teachers. So it's an admission that teachers may not be perfect. They may have sometimes erred, or they may have behaved in improper manner, perhaps, for example, scolding a student, losing one's temper, things like that. So don't take this into account. Just take the best of what we presented to you, students, and honor those good practices. So, and then learn to give. Giving, dana, is a sacred duty in ancient India. And you have to accumulate wealth, therefore, to be able to give, if we are talking about giving wealth. But this is what it is about. You should give plentifully. You should give with modesty. Don't boast about what you give. Don't do like our American billionaires who are in the news every time they give a small part of their fortune. Give with modesty. Be quiet about it. And give with sympathy. You should empathize with the object of your donation. So these are some of the values which emerge from the whole period of education as a child before moving to adult life. And this was imparted in basically ashrams or small settlements which were around the home of the teacher. So the teacher, the acharya, there are different names, we'll see some of them. First of all, when the child enters this ashram now, perhaps at the age of 5 or 6 or 7, the child is initiated. So it is an upanayana, it is an initiation, and this concerns only the 3 upper varnas at that stage, at that point of time. But we will see that the 4th varna is not always excluded, far from it. And then this is regarded as a new birth. So this is the initiation initially, usually 12 years. And as I said just now, it's the 3 higher castes at that early Vedic period. Rather, not so early, because we don't know really much about education. For example, at the time of the Rig Veda, the earliest Veda of India, we don't know. This is rather called the late Vedic period, the period of the Upanishads and many other texts. And possibly girls, because we have a lot of traditions about women scholars, such as Gargi, such as Maitreyi. Some of the wives of the rishis were themselves composing hymns in the Rig Veda. So there is a tradition of learning for certain categories of girls and women. This is undeniable, but we don't have, of course, quantified data on this. Now about the methods, and this is something which is now becoming increasingly relevant, because modern education has really strayed from the true goals and objectives of education and the true methods involving the mind, stimulating the mind and, if possible, the heart and the body of the student all the time. This was a major concern, as we will see, in ancient India, and we find that there is a certain method called tarka, argumentation, debating, questioning, which involves questions and answers and cross-questioning again and so on. And there are many examples, even the Upanishads themselves, those ancient, highly philosophical, spiritual texts of India, which are invaluable, or very often use dialogue as a method to impart the knowledge. So this is something that you can check for yourself. I give a reference here to the Chandogya Upanishad. And lastly, before we expand these items, I would like to stress the point that there is no corporal punishment. And there are specific mentions that this is a last resort. It is frowned upon. The teacher is assumed to have enough genuine inner strength, authority, to inspire enough respect so that there will be no need of any form of punishment. If there is any need, it should be a constructive punishment or some disciplining which is of a positive kind. It should not be corporal. So this is quite clear in some of the texts, and therefore it is regarded as a failure of the teacher if he has to take a stick and beat the students. In those days, teaching was free, education was free. The teachers were not supposed to take any form of payment, but there could be a parting gift called dakshina. So dakshina is something that the child concluding his or her period of education offers, and this would be often, in those ancient days, gifts in kind. For example, it could be some cattle, it could be some amount of rice, it could be something of the sort. And then we know that apart from some main topics which we are going to see soon, there were a number of specialized studies, such as the study of snakes. Why snakes? Well, because you live in nature, you teach under a tree, you better know which snakes are venomous and which snakes are not, which today most children do not know. The study of omens, the study of medicine, etc., etc. We will return to this question. Before we do, let me show you a couple of examples from the Indian temples, where we have sometimes panels depicting these kind of scenes. Of course, this comes at a much later period. But nevertheless, here is a case from Khajuraho, the Lakshmana temple, where you see a guru, an acharya, a teacher, seated, again, always on a slightly raised platform. And you see his students, both male and female. Actually, those sitting are senior students, clearly because of the beard. Others, younger ones, are standing, and the ladies are behind him. You can see also that the guru is not exactly an ascetic. He is clearly well fed. They are not supposed to be ascetics all the time. Rather, they are supposed to impart knowledge and be exemplar of ethics. This is the expectation from them. This is another frieze or panel from Konark in Odisha, and where you see now again at the top a teacher and his disciples. But here there is a difference compared with the previous panel, where now he's holding something in his hand, in his two hands in fact. What is that something? It's a palm leaf of a manuscript. So this teacher, unlike the previous one, who was teaching purely orally, verbally, without any written material as support, this one is using written material, some text, to teach. So both methods were all right, but you can see that the students are not writing down. They are not copying what the teacher is saying. They are listening, they are absorbing. So education remains largely oral, even if a text is involved. Interestingly, at the bottom, you can see a practice of martial arts, some training of the physical body, and that was always regarded as very important. The body physical education, which now there are attempts to reintegrate fully in Indian education, that was regarded as most important. A balanced, fulfilled person could not be achieved just through the education of the mind. So there are other aspects. We will now see how this was working out in more detail. Initially, at the late Vedic period, the knowledge was centered around the Vedas. So this graph shows all the disciplines, the various fields of knowledge, many of them very elaborate, vast fields, which were connected to a proper understanding and practice of the Vedas, all the way to rituals, including astronomy. Jyotisha was astronomy, not astrology at those times. And the purpose was, of course, to set a calendar for these rituals and to understand the rhythms of the cosmos and organize life around them. So these fields, which I will not develop, basically are the fundamental fields that knowledge of the Vedas would require. But there is another approach which takes shape gradually, and which we can conveniently distinguish between inner learning and outer learning. And this is not something which is explicit in the text. There is no text, to my knowledge, which makes this classification. Rather, this is something that we can derive from all the ancient sources of education. What do we mean by inner learning? It's about developing all the inner qualities that make a good, not only a good student, but a good human being. So those which are mentioned in the text here and there include patience, regularity, dedication, self-denial, self-mastery, humility, concentration in the pursuit of knowledge. If there is no concentration, no desire to acquire knowledge, nothing will work. Purity of nature, which means basically the absence of major flaws and a certain set of ethical values which India developed. And the study of yoga and the Yoga Sutras, which are Patanjali's famous text laying down the foundations for yoga. Though certain forms of yoga certainly existed before Patanjali, there is no doubt about that. So this is what, in a nutshell, can build a good human being. But outer learning is mentioned. So first of all, the Vedas themselves, for this is addressed only to the Brahmanas, the Brahmins as we say today, those whose job was to transmit, learn and transmit and recite the Vedas themselves. And this is about a lot of memorizing to a prodigious extent, because all these texts, which are not small texts, were transmitted orally without any distortion for thousands of years. And Vedic chanting is recognized by UNESCO as part of the intangible heritage of humanity. So then the 6 Vedangas, which the previous slide listed. Philosophy in India is called darshana. Darshana is vision. So philosophy basically, whereas the Greek word is philo, love, Sophia of wisdom, the Indian word darshana is about seeing the truth. So the approach is already a little bit different. And there are many schools of philosophy, of course. The art of debating, we already alluded to debate, questioning, and refining this approach to come to the truth as closely as possible. Of course, this is not uniquely Indian. For example, the Greeks have those very famous dialogues with Socrates, among others. So this is a natural approach to the truth, which unfortunately our Indian education has forgotten and is now trying to reintegrate. Historical tradition, itihasa, is one topic. Itihasa, unlike the Hindi word itihas, itihasa is not history. It is something much bigger than that. It includes tradition, it includes mythology, it includes the teaching of dharma, it includes many things. So not to be confused, Dharma Sutras, which are usually translated as laws, but a better word would be guideline, the guidelines for the society. And the Dharma Sutras are not imposed on the society, they are suggested by the authors. So it's a very complex topic. Military arts and botany and zoology, for 2 reasons. One, because people live very close to nature, and therefore even if they were big cities, and they were big cities, people were close to nature, and therefore they had to understand what is the virtue of this plant, what is this animal like, how does it behave, and so on. But also botany and zoology for Ayurveda, because there cannot be Ayurveda without these 2 disciplines. Ayurvedic students had a separate initiation, and there was a kind of an oath taken initially, which was specific to that discipline. Now let us look at the practical psychology that really shaped this whole approach to education, and it's about the Panchakosha. What are the Panchakoshas? Well, these are supposed to be the 5 parts that are in us, that are our real identity, and not just our superficial personality as we often think. So in the Indian view, and it's Vedantic largely, but not exclusively Vedantic either, we begin of course with the body, Annamaya Purusha or Annamaya Kosha. And Anna is food, but it's also matter. So how do you develop it? Well, through martial arts, as we saw, mastery of weapons, self-mastery, self-control, self-discipline. These are the methods to develop a harmonious body, healthy body, and a body that will really bear the challenges of life. Pranamaya Purusha. Prana is of course breath, life, energy, but it is also the whole emotional world, and Pranamaya Purusha takes care of this, and therefore has to be developed through poetry, literature, the arts. The arts especially have a very important role to play, and I'm glad that they are now being reintegrated gradually in school education in India, whereas they were really thrown to the margins as being something just good enough for decoration. Manomaya Purusha is what we are more familiar with. This is the intellect, but it has to be developed towards what we call today a critical mind, and this is not a new notion. This notion of a critical mind is very ancient in India, and it has to be sharpened through reasoning, logic, debating again, and the development of memory. Not in the sense of mechanical dead rote learning, but in the sense of carrying with you enough that will allow you to engage in such debates and such reasoning. So you should know something of the text, you should know something of what people coming before you have said or argued or elaborated. You should know enough of the world, etc. And Vijnana Maya Purusha is now the spiritual part of us. It is above the mind in the Indian view. And this requires techniques of yoga, meditation, and so on. And this is explained in a number of texts. Beyond those 4 is Anandamaya Purusha, which is our divine being, but that is not something that can be subjected to education. It is something to be discovered that is different. Martial arts, very developed. We see that reflected in many texts, like Mahabharata, for example. But it's certainly an ancient tradition, still alive today in traditional ways in parts of India. And this book, for example, Encyclopedia of Indian Physical Culture, is one of the very, very solid studies about all the methods of physical education that were still prevalent in India in the 19th and to some extent 20th century. And the whole tradition of, for example, we are proud of our wrestlers in India, but they belong to actually a tradition of kusti. There are other words which can be traced to those ancient times. Naturally, what you see at the Olympics is a little bit different, but it is still compatible. We can see some of these places where kusti in the north, Kalaripayattu in the south, Shilambam in the Tamil region are practiced. Shilambam is more about sticks and combating with sticks. So lots of very impressive practices everywhere, and this is something that should be brought back to the mainstream. Now we go to some more formal education which will happen once Buddhism and Jainism will emerge around the 6th century BCE. And we find that they also, like the Vedic schools of thought, value education very highly, but they introduce something new, which is the institution of the monastery, the vihara. And Buddhism, for example, creates something like 5,000 monasteries across India, possibly quite much more. And Jainism, something equivalent, the Jain schools. And all these monasteries double up as not only centers where the monks practice their religious yogic discipline, but also as centers of learning, where younger people are brought in. Some of them may be initiated as monks, some may not be, and they are taught. They are taught, and we will see what they are taught. So, just for Buddhism, it was, of course, initially centered about Buddhist texts, the teaching of the Buddha, and therefore the languages that went with them, initially Pali, which is one of the Prakrits, more elaborate or more formalized Prakrit, and the Prakrits themselves, which are basically the languages that the people were using, but also Sanskrit, because Sanskrit is not only the foundation for those languages, but it also becomes a full-fledged language for generally later texts of Buddhism, and the same thing in Jainism. So again, debates and discussion. The same tradition basically continues. There's no big shift. So here we have texts spelling out the 5 sciences in primary education: grammar, because without grammar you cannot master the languages; arts and crafts; medicine, very important; logic, and logic includes debating and so on; and then the spiritual knowledge, adhyatma vidya, which is of course the supreme knowledge. That is the ultimate goal. But there are again many specialized topics mentioned in the literature, like the handicrafts, accounting. When you have a big monastery, you have to keep accounts, you have to keep administrative records of it; drawing and painting; medicine and surgery. So, and this is not at all an exhaustive list. So if we look at the archaeological records again very briefly, at Takshashila today in northwest Pakistan, we have a lot of ruins, beautiful ruins, which show that it was not only a major urban center, but also a center of learning right from the 5th, possibly 6th century BC. And people came from various regions of India and a little beyond, but they entered, from what we can gather from the text, though there could very well have been a few schools for younger people, they started their studies at 16. So this was for higher, more specialized studies into the Vedas, Buddhism, science, the arts and crafts, medicine, law, military science, and so on and so forth. But also very technical topics, like, for example, elephant training, horse training, archery, and so on. So do not think that because these institutions were Buddhist, Buddhism promotes, like Jainism, ahimsa in a big way, and to some extent the Hindu schools also. But there is a place and time for ahimsa, and there is also a place and time for other things like martial arts, like sometimes even warfare. And here is an interesting tradition where Kautilya, the author of Arthashastra, the famous text of polity, governance, economics, is supposed to have been among the teachers. And Chandragupta Maurya, his pupil, among the students there, including also Charaka, one of the masters of Ayurveda. So this is a later tradition, basically. There is no finality about it, but it's interesting that the place is known in the literature for that. These are some of the remains, stupas, etc. at Takshashila, and with that we jump almost 1,000 years, and we come to Nalanda University, the famous ancient university of India, where very imposing monasteries were built with these bricks that you can see. And you can also see on the top right small kind of cubicles. There are small cells where the monks probably were residing, or perhaps the students were studying. And there was a huge organization, because there were thousands of students, huge organization, infrastructure to feed this entire population of students and teachers and monks. Of course, most of the teachers were monks themselves, and then the administration part of it and so on. So it really functioned very much as, to some extent, a modern university. We have some historical details which I will let you study, but we also have very interesting testimonies by Chinese pilgrims, Buddhist pilgrims basically, who came to India to discover, explore, visit and study the followers of the Buddha, his teachings, all the texts, etc. And they visited Nalanda and they left very important testimonies, such as about the massiveness of the whole infrastructure, the different halls, the apartments for the monks and so on, and the classrooms and the whole surrounding. So Nalanda is not fully explored. There are still possibilities, and some remote sensing studies have shown that there are probably still some unexcavated monasteries there, and it was a very vibrant center of learning which attracted students from well beyond India, including Tibet, by the way. So these are the figures that they give us, but of course there is no exact means to cross-check them precisely. However, they are compatible with the structures that have been excavated and with the unexcavated structures, if they are correct. They are more or less of the same order of magnitude. The students attend the discourses, the lectures, without any fail, even for a minute. So this is the kind of discipline that is followed in the university. And then we have an abbot principal, who would be the equivalent of our vice chancellors today, and assisted by two council, one for academic matters and the other for administrative matters. This is pretty much the way modern universities also function. Plus, there was a body of students taking part in decision making. So this is very far-sighted, and again, quite something we are familiar with in the modern context. It had connections not only with China and Tibet, but with Southeast Asia. You can study those details later. And though Mahayana Buddhism, which is a later school of Buddhism, which reintegrated, for example, gods and goddesses and many rituals, was the dominance in Nalanda, the dominant school of thought, you might say. At the same time, Hinayana, which is also called Theravada school, which is the more original school of Buddhism, was also studied. And in fact, Vedic texts also were studied. They were not excluded. So, therefore, and Vedanta, Sankhya philosophy, Chikitsa Shastra is the ancient word for medicine, of course. All of this was part of the curriculum. And once again, different parts of the world that students were coming from. And then the importance of, again, discussing, debating, and the fact that the students were kind of interviewed before they could enter Nalanda, and it's only if they were able to answer the probing questions that they were accepted. So therefore, this is something that, again, our educational system has largely forgotten. There is no or not enough room for discussion, debate, questioning, cross-questioning, but this is something that has to come back if we wish to awaken the intellects of our younger population. Nalanda was destroyed, like many other centers of learning of the whole Gangetic region and other parts of India, in fact, towards the end of the 12th century CE by Bakhtiyar Khilji, according to the tradition and whatever can be reconstructed from the text. and it was set on fire. There are different traditions about the, how long, for how many months the library kept burning. It was supposed to have lakhs of manuscripts. There is no doubt at all that the loss of its library is a huge loss for us to understand ancient India. There would have been an extraordinary wealth of topics of which we can perhaps no longer have an idea. So this is of great importance. The Chinese pilgrims were very keen before they left to leave with as many manuscripts as possible. The Tibetan monks who were there at Nalanda and who fled the destruction also took with them a number of manuscripts, brought them to Tibet, translated them into Tibetan, and some of them are still being retranslated or recreated back in the original Sanskrit. So this is the end of this Nalanda, but not quite the end, because we have a later testimony, about 40 years after the destruction, of a very senior monk known as Dharma Swamin, 90-year-old. I'm sorry, the name of the monk is Rahula Srivadra, and it is Dharma Swamin is the visitor, and he finds that this 90-year-old teacher is still teaching a small class of 70. The class is not so small, but that's the only population left. So it's in the ruins of Nalanda, and still this teacher at this advanced age, when he could be just quietly resting, is keen to continue teaching. It shows you the dedication. It shows you again the sacredness attached to transmission of knowledge. In fact, I could have quoted early on, there is one Subhashita, one wise saying of India, which says more or less that a teacher who cannot find one worthy student to whom he can transmit his knowledge will have to go to hell. So this is just a popular way to say that having knowledge will not save you. You have to pass it on. I will move fast over these slides. You can study them. They are self-explanatory. It's about many, many more Nalandas, some of them unknown or unexcavated, which followed the same organization and which were destroyed in the same manner. So this was a very important turning point in the history of Indian education, where suddenly all these institutions, or most of them, became dysfunctional or disappeared, except in some farther regions of India, such as the south, for example. One thing which comes up in the literature from time to time, both Buddhist and Hindu, there was, of course, no word as Hindu in those days, but this means the late Vedic schools of belief and thought. One text which comes back again is the 64 arts, the 64 kala of India. And this is something that is fairly well known, but we do not take time to read the description of them, which I'm not going to do, but I would invite you to see those slides, because it shows the incredible diversity of intellectual occupations and pursuits, manual pursuits, a lot of crafts, a lot of skills, manual skills there, a lot of them oriented towards aesthetics, and also intellectual games and skills that are actually lost, most of them. So it's a mind-boggling list, and of course it's not as if all of this could be taught. No one for sure could ever be a master of all these, from gambling to decoration with flowers, and of course knowledge of philosophy and languages and whatnot. But it just shows the range, and this is something we should be aware of. A brief look at the south, where the picture was a little bit different. The institutions tended to be smaller but more numerous because they were attached to temples, mathas also, and therefore there is this constant association between so-called religious places, so-called because it's simply our limitation that we project on those places, such as monasteries and temples, and the fact that they were very vibrant centers of learning, and often also all kinds of artistic and social activities. So we have inscriptions about these endowments of these institutions. They were endowed by very often the communities themselves, or by rich traders, occasionally also by a king or a queen. Here the teachers often receive some form of payment, and but not necessarily from the student. It could be from the community supporting the teacher or the center of learning. And we see again subjects like Vedas, Vedantas, Mimamsa, one of the main schools of Indian philosophy, Vyakarana, Grammar, and so on. And we have specific inscriptions about some of those centers. You have here one example under Rajendra Chola I, where you have 270 junior students, 70 senior students, and 14 teachers. It's always very interesting, by the way, to calculate the ratio of teachers to students, because it's often quite advantageous compared to today's ratio. We will now look at the last part of this talk. It's a very brief survey, of course, because this is a huge field in itself, but we have to look at education in India as it was before the colonial time, that is to say from the late 18th century onward. That is the colonial period, as you know, or you should know. But before that, what was the situation in India which led some of the British statesmen, colonial masters, to declare that there was no such thing as education before they came? In fact, this was their own ignorance again, because it so happens that we have a lot of data on education before the colonial times, and all of this, almost all of this, comes to us from British reports by early British administrators. And before that, I will first quote briefly a few travelers to India before we come to the British times. This is Pietro della Valle. I forget his exact nationality. Was he Spanish or Portuguese? I'm no longer sure, but it doesn't matter. He's in the 17th century, and his description of education as he witnessed it is remarkable, because he immediately tells us some very, very important features. So without reading the full quotation, first of all, the importance given to education. That's the first important point. Secondly, the fact that women were also taught. How many, what percentage? Of course, we don't know, but we'll come back to that. And that Brahmins were often the schoolmasters, the teachers, but any of the caste may and often do practice teaching. This is very important to note. The children are instructed without violence, and remember that corporal punishment is looked down upon, and by a very simple process, which is, as far as literacy is concerned, and numeracy probably also, to use the sand as your slate and simply write with your finger. So there is absolutely no material required, and of course this could be in one part of India, it would not be all over the place the same, but therefore his conclusion was that reading and writing are acquired at the same time and by the same process: literacy, numeracy. We jump 100 years and we have another Paolino da Bartolomeo, another traveler to India, who is a Christian priest and or monk, and who now visits Malabar, this part of Kerala today, and who describes what kind of payment the teachers receive, but also, more importantly for us, the fact that they can also instruct the children without any fee. They will be paid by those who manage the temples or the head of the caste, the community. This is what I said earlier. It will be usually the community that supports education. So then they can move on to higher education later on. So there are very interesting details, but I will move on. And first of all, we will see at the end of the 18th century what is probably the last traditional university of India in the line initiated by Takshashila, Nalanda, and so on. And the great Gandhian scholar Dharampal brought out those notes and they are available in his archives, where we have one university with 3 colleges, and you have to go through these details here, where we see that up to 4,000 students were being taught all kinds of disciplines again. So this shows that it was not a small place, and this was supported by either the agriculture around, the revenue of the lands, which was also the case at Nalanda incidentally, but occasionally by the local ruler if that was not sufficient. So this is again something that documents the importance of dialogue, disputation on any particular topic that is being learned, and the whole process is explained, including the privilege that the student has to interrogate the master. So the student has a right to question the master. This is always a given, which is not always accepted, in our schools across India, but hopefully will be now with the new national education policy, which precisely stresses, emphasizes again and again this need for discussion, debates within the students, among the students, and from student to teacher in both directions. So you see again a pandit, a teacher who would lose his temper in explaining any point, even to a dull-minded teacher, would lose his reputation. So this is very important. Let's continue our journey, and now we come to the British period, where we have Prendergast from the Bombay Presidency, a high administrator, who insists that there is hardly a village in India, at least through the British territories and of course beyond, where there is not at least one school, and larger villages have more than one. And the system again is extremely economical. It just costs a handful of grain a month to learn the basic skills. And therefore, when he compares this system with the British system, he says that he doesn't find that the Indian cultivators or traders are in any way less than in Britain. He says that the way the dealers, the traders, the bankers keep their books shows such a fluency of practice, conciseness, clearness, which he thinks is quite equal to those of the British traders. So these are very important testimonies, but we have now much bigger testimonies, much more substantial, coming to us from William Adam, who authors 3 famous reports, and they are available on the net. And I would invite those of you who wish to go deeper into the history of India's pre-colonial education, how William Adam documents meticulously the school system in the early 19th century. So all the way to the humblest classes, as he puts it. So in Bengal and Bihar, which at that time were together in the same presidency, no less than 1 or 1.5 lakh village schools were documented. On average, one school for 63 children. These are, of course, approximate figures, but they must be more or less in the proper range. And it shows, therefore, that there was no scruple about holding school for a small number of children, which is something that often bothers state governments nowadays in India. We have also institutions of higher learning in the Bengal presidency. Madras also, as it was then called, 322 native schools and colleges, and so on. So these figures, you can look at them. There are many, many more figures across the British presidencies. And again, how the villages support the student who came to study is documented. So this community support is extremely important. It is from ancient times onward, and it shows that the whole community, and this is not about caste or elite, supports this idea of providing a good education, at least for some basic skills. And Adam himself writes that a lot more details about the cost of the education, the fact that it is given freely to most students, the fact that there are endowments of land, gifts of money from the community, from the traders, etc. So we have now a whole economic life that comes with it. I took example from one sector of the Madras presidency near Coimbatore, and you see that the dominant number of villagers in those schools are actually the Shudras. And this is very surprising, apparently, because we are told that the fourth Varna was excluded from education. It's not true. It is simply not true. The figures are there. And this is from British reports. Why is it that the lowest number is from the Vaishyas, the traders? Because Vaishyas needed specialized skills of bookkeeping and accounting and managing the goods and so on. And this was best learned on the spot, hands-on. So therefore, we don't find so many of them. And the same with the Brahmins, because the Brahmins needed specialized learning in, for example, Vedic chanting, in Sanskrit grammar, and so on. And that would be provided sometimes directly from Guru to Shishya. So these are very revealing figures, and also the fact that some girls were attending. Not many, only 1% in Coimbatore and Madurai regions, but if you move further west to Malabar, you have 15%, which is a very substantial proportion. Of course, many girls were taught at home. They could be very well educated at the same time, but at home because they were supposed to be prepared to married life and so on and so forth. And marriage in those days took place generally at an early age. So therefore, it's not surprising that we don't find 50% of girls, but the fact that girls do attend and that numbers are flexible shows that there is no ban, no prohibition on teaching girls, and that's very important. So now, to conclude, there are many more quotations. I'm just going to let you study them. It's again about the variety of castes. For example, here we are told about the barbers. The barbers were those who, of course, shaved people, but they were often also the surgeons, because they were used to handling cutting instruments. So this is, in many parts of the world, highest proportion of some of the specialized professions attending village schools. So this is again about the diversity and also something about the topics which is said in this quotation, which you will please study more closely. And the same with this final quotation from Dharampal, who wrote this very important book called The Beautiful Tree, also available on the internet, where he sums up this whole set of data collected carefully by British officials in the early 19th century. And there again we have something about the different castes, different communities participating, and the fact here also something about Muslim girls and Muslim boys participating in school education. But very often the Muslim girls and boys had separate schools for their own education, because there would be a religious element added to it. So these are very important data. This is an example of a Muslim school, in fact, in the late 19th century. And all this data basically transforms our prejudiced view against Indian education. It was a very efficient, decentralized, widespread system that imparted all kinds of skills, beginning with literacy and numeracy. This list of topics is again from the Adams reports. You can go through them and you can see that there's a diversity of fields of knowledge, disciplines, subject matters, if you wish to call them that, but we should not take this as uniform because there was no central board dictating a curriculum. Basically, all this was a very organic system and it was free to organize itself as it wanted. To sum up and conclude, I would like to say that the main ideas we should imbibe from this brief journey through Indian education is, first of all, how highly valued, revered, I should say, education and knowledge was. This is something fundamental. Secondly, the objective was not, in those days, to get a job. Of course, professional skills were imparted, from accounting to medicine to, for the priest, rituals, conduct of rituals, and of course all the crafts, very, very important. But then the crafts very often would have to be learnt hands-on, so directly with the craftsman. So this whole system was well-oiled, comprehensive, and ultimately its objective was to develop the student, both inside ethics, spirituality, call it whatever you wish, but the inner parts of us as well as our outer personality, which often we take to be ourselves, but the outer personality is only a shell. It is not our essence. This is, of course, the Indian philosophy in short. And as I said, it is decentralized, it was very economical, and it had full support from local communities and occasionally rulers and traders and so on. Specialized disciplines, but also disciplines for all. And whether we should not limit education to formal education as we understand it. There were many other ways in which people received educations. For example, the folk arts was not something formalized, but it did impart skills in drama, in poetry, in literature sometimes, and so on. Storytelling and all kinds of oral transmission of culture would also be part of education. I will close with this, and I will encourage you to study for yourself more of the history of Indian education, its approach, its methods, its whole philosophy of what education should be about, because undeniably there is a lot from it that we can adapt to our present times and which is still relevant. It's not about going back to a small gurukul under a tree. There's nothing wrong with it if it can be done for some people, but it's about learning the methods and the spirit of the whole, what is meant by education. And in fact, the National Education Policy, which was published in 2020, makes a lot of references, justifiably so in my opinion, to ancient systems, ancient views, ancient practices. So therefore, let us be aware once again of our history, and this is also one of the components of Indian civilization, a very important one in fact. Without education there would not have been a continuous civilization for the past few millennia, and you know, the more we study and understand this civilization, the more proud, justifiably proud, we will be about its accomplishments. Thank you.